Hello, my name is Kate Mildenhall and I'm an author. My new novel is called The Hummingbird Effect. It's published by Scribner via Simon & Schuster Australia. It's the story of women across generations. It spans from 1933 to 2181, and it's the story of women's labour, of women's loves, and the families and connections they form to care for each other. It's a story about AI, rivers, the future, the past, and what we might be prepared to sacrifice for a chance at a better future. So my very first novel was historical fiction, Skylarking, and it was based on a true story. And I found that easy in a way to follow the skeleton of a true story to write that story. I went in a completely different direction for my second novel, The Mother Fault, which is speculative fiction. And in part, I just wanted to stretch myself as a writer and see what I could do. This one is a bit of a combination of both. I started with a true story about a strike in 1933 at the Angliss Meat Works, and that forms a historical section of the novel. But then I found that I also needed to stretch both into the present day and into the future as well. So it's a little bit of a combination of both. I started thinking that I would write a full novel based in 1933 about the Angliss Meat Works. And one of the things that happened during the writing was, of course, that we came into a pandemic. And that so informed the way I was thinking about labour, and invisible labour in particular. Meat workers were all over the news and were being impacted particularly by the pandemic and the fact that they had to keep turning up to work. Also healthcare workers. So the novel kind of exploded into the present moment and became something that I was not prepared for. The novel follows 4 key different narrative timelines: that of Peggy and Lil in 1933, Hilda, who's in an aged care residence in lockdown in Melbourne in 2020, Lara and Kat, who live in Footscray in just a slightly pushed future in 2031, and then Maz and Onyx, who are 2 young sisters who live in 2181 in a very different world. Combining those, or threading through those, I suppose, is the voice of a river, which gives a sense of deep time, is what I was wanting to do in that. And then there's also an AI, the Hummingbird algorithm, who chats with a person, Eris X, about ways in which they might uninvent innovations from the past for a chance at a better future. I think one of the challenges of world building a future world is that you have all possibilities open to you. And one of the things that really, I suppose, was a challenge for me during that was the responsibility that you have in what you choose to put into that future, a kind of an ethical responsibility. I was really interested in the work of Kim Stanley Robinson and the idea of pushing past the collapse or the apocalypse. That's interesting. There's a lot of conflict, but what's more interesting is seeing what a potential small future society might bring forward into a new world. So that was something that I was really interested in. And also the work of writer and thinker Jane McGonigal, who wrote an incredible book called, I think it's called Imaginable, where she talks about the what ifs of the future and really having a radical imagination about what might be possible. And so what I wanted to do was to think about ways in which that future both reflected, what the science says in terms of what it will look like as a climate impacted future, but also what we might bring forward and change and shift as a society ourselves. The language for the future was really difficult but also fun. And one of the things that I did was this kind of vernacular that the girls in their group speak in. They mush a lot of words together. And I had fun researching and thinking about why those words would be in use, what we would bring forward. Lots of different things informed that sense of the future. The group that the girls begin the story with is called the Last Stewards. And their philosophy is somewhat based on the idea of voluntary extinctionism, which is a movement that I was not aware of for a group of people who really think that our future relies on humanity being completely gone. And you can join the voluntary extinctionists and you can get a pin if you decide that you will never have a child. So, it was quite scary at times reading some of their philosophy, but I did want to touch on these different ideas that already exist. The hummingbird effect comes directly from the work of Stephen Johnson, who's a writer and a thinker and now heads up, I think, the TEDx podcast. He wrote a book called How We Got to Now, which is about innovations from the past that really changed the trajectory of the future, things like the light bulb, in all the ways that it impacted the future. And the hummingbird effect refers to this idea that an innovation in one area can have really enormous consequences, often unintended consequences, in an entirely different area of life. And because I started, Katie, with that idea of 1933 and the introduction of the chain to the slaughterhouse, which changed the way abattoirs operated forever. And the question I was curious about was, what if that strike had have been successful across the globe and the chain and that automation had never come into that factory system? What might the world look like now? So the hummingbird effect seemed to beautifully sum up that idea of how progress works and how it might be undone. That was the seed originally of the novel, the idea of the meatworks. A lot of my family live over in Footscray and had lived quite close to the meatworks. And even though they had been out of use for a long time, there was a huge fire there in the early 90s. And my uncle described the way that the flames went up because there were 100 years of sawdust and fat in the floor. Now, for a writer, an image like that is such a gift, and that's what I started with. There were extraordinary historical archives and interviews with so many of the meat workers that had been put together and kept by the Living Museum of the West in Footscray and also the Footscray Historical Society. So I had access to those, and immediately all the ideas in my head about what an abattoir would be like to work in and the kinds of ideas I had about it, because I came in through these interviews with people who loved their job, who loved the community during the 30s and 40s and 50s that was built around the meatworks, I had what felt like a kind of an insider view in terms of the way the meatworks operated. Because I wrote much of this section during COVID, I didn't have access to go and see an abattoir, which I thought I really needed to do as a kind of respect to the research. But I did eventually. So when the lockdowns finished in such a way that I could have access, I went with a union representative down to a meatworks in Geelong and spent a couple of hours touring that facility. And I'm really glad that I did it, because I feel like for my process as a writer, that was something that was important for me to witness. But it was also incredibly difficult to do. And I don't think it's something that I will do again. I have been writing this novel for 4 years. I did not realise that it would come out at a time where our conversation about AI was so huge. What it did mean, though, was that because I'd already been thinking about an algorithm that could somehow change the world, as I progressed in my writing, I started to play with ChatGPT as part of my creative process. So I started to ask it questions. How would you destroy the world, for instance? Now, ChatGPT is not allowed to answer that question because it can't allow us to harm other people, or so it says, although you can get around it. So when I asked it, when I said that I was a philosophy professor and I wanted to give some scenarios to my class about ways in which the world might end and who might do that, it could give me speculative scenarios. So this idea of playing with ChatGPT as a creative provocation for myself, asking it philosophical questions, asking it about its own biases and how it was answering the questions that I put to it, was really interesting to me. There's one section in the novel where Eris X, who is the person asking the bot questions about the future, asks it to write a poem to save the world. Now, I did do that. And ChatGPT did give me the poem that is referenced in the novel. It's terrible. It's utterly terrible. But I thought that was a fun way of playing with it. And I have, like so many people do, deep concerns about the ownership of artificial intelligence systems, of large language learning models. about ideas of copyright and artistic integrity. But I also think that the best way that we can work towards answers to those things is to keep having the conversation about it. Look at the ways in which there are extraordinary things that AI can offer us as a society and a community, and there are also pitfalls. And the best way to do it is to kind of dive in head first and see what it can do and see what its limitations are. One of the things that happened over the writing of this book is that my beloved grandmother got sick and we lost her last year. We were extraordinarily lucky as a family that we got to nurse her at home and she didn't have to go into the healthcare system, as it were. But our fear was that she would. And not because we thought that she wouldn't get good care. There's lots of healthcare workers amongst our family, but that we wouldn't be able to see her and that she would be extraordinarily isolated. And one of the things that I think really frustrated me and so many people during those early lockdowns, particularly in Melbourne, was health workers being demonised because they were moving between aged care residences in particular, sometimes spreading COVID, unintentionally, of course, because there were not enough healthcare workers, because they had been pulled from work, but also because many of those healthcare workers had to keep working, double, sometimes triple shifts. So I thought that the parallels between looking at invisible labour that we don't recognise, and that we don't often respect as a culture, in the meatworks and then in these aged care systems, there was so much correlation there, I couldn't not write about it. What I did when I was writing that section was I was really aware that I don't want to go back into thinking about lockdowns, and I'm sure that my readers don't necessarily. But there's also a sense of having to bear witness to that time. It already seems as though it's a time in the past, and it's not. There is still a pandemic. We are still in this. So what I did for particularly some of those sections was to go back through my own WhatsApp threads with my friends and my family and directly pull some of the conversations and some of the things we were having. Also many of the headlines, things that we particularly in Melbourne became very familiar with. I've put them in there. And then I was really lucky that another writer, Sam Coley, who wrote State Highway 1, I met with him in New Zealand when I was on a residency, had no idea that he'd been working very high up in HR in New South Wales aged care during the pandemic. And so he very beautifully did a read of that section for me to check that I had the language right. He gave me lots of great advice about some of the systems kind of language. And I also went back through lots of those extraordinary kinds of journalism that looked at aged care and some of the great pitfalls there. And I used that in that work as well. My publisher is Ben Ball. And at one stage he did say to me, do you think we could make Jack a little nicer? I was like, nah, I don't think so. Look, I have, great love for many of the men in my life and men in general. But this is a book of women and for women and putting them at the forefront of the stories. So unfortunately, that meant that sometimes when I had to put in a terrible person, it was a bloke. I did for Jack, who is the very charismatic slaughterman that Peggy falls for in 1933. I did really want to give the sense, as in so many of the characters we both love and despise, that he is charming and attractive, and we utterly understand why Peggy would fall for him, at the same time as there are these deeper levels of violence and threat in his life as well. So yeah, unfortunately, this one isn't a book that really puts good men at its centre. The First Time podcast is such a delight to be part of. It really is one of those things. Catherine Collette and I started this 6 years ago now, and we had no idea what it would lead to for us or what it would mean. I've now had the great privilege of speaking to so many incredible writers. Winton and Helen Garner and Charlotte Wood and Christos Tsiolkas. I mean, the list goes on. I'm forgetting people, but it's been kind of like a masterclass in writing for both of us. I've learnt so much from the podcast. And also just being out and about on the road this past couple of weeks with the launch of the book. I have met so many listeners, so many writers who are at early stages in their career who have said, thank you for this podcast. Thank you for the conversations you have. Thank you for being honest about what the process looks like and how sometimes it's really crap. So I feel really proud that we've been able to create this thing, and that it's both a resource and a help for other people, as well as such a great learning experience for Catherine and I as well. I must say, I'm off to Canberra Writers Festival this weekend, so I have just read an early copy of Mirandy Rewo's Sunbirds, which I absolutely adored. It's historical fiction set in 1941 in West Java. It chronicles the life of 3 different characters specifically, but also the Japanese forces moving their way towards West Java, ideas of love and desire and identity, also of imperialism and colonisation. It is such a lush kind of book to spend time with. I honestly thought when I came out of the reading that I would kind of have, jungle sweat on me and a flower tucked behind my ear. Mirandy is just such a fabulous writer. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation and for that book coming out too. I only get one idea at a time, Katie, and I'm very, very glad that the new idea has already come to me. So what I am planning to do is to carve out some little blocks of time where I can go and start getting writing again, which is the most exciting part. This stuff is all very fun and lovely, but one of the things that I've come to realise 3 books in is that the most exciting and thrilling part is getting back to the page. So I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you so much for having me, Katie.